I think when you get somebody on that also has a company that's like different from yours, but in the same industry, oftentimes you might get like some kind of affiliate.
Yeah, professional partnership.
Yes, professional partnership with them. And that also makes money or can potentially make money, which is attributed to your podcast. Hello and welcome back to Oh My Pod. I'm Celine.
And I'm Justin.
And today we're going to talk about one of the most frequently asked questions, how to make money from your podcast.
Yeah, we do get asked that a lot. And there's a lot of information floating around about
on it. Yeah,
how to
exactly.
do that. Yeah.
And people mostly think they can only get a sponsorship and that's the only thing to monetize. But
yeah, like
there's
putting
actually,
an ad in your show.
There's so much more to it.
There really is. Yep. And there's probably a couple things that we won't touch on here, but these are some of the ways that we've seen in action. And some like indirect ways too. Like not everything that we're going to discuss is direct like dollars in your bank account, but in the end it sort of is, depending on how you think about money. So let's just hop right into it. Number one is clients. So that's kind of the most obvious.
I think it is really obvious, but people still don't really. I think people don't think when they get a new client and it comes from the podcast, they don't really attribute it to a podcast sometimes. I feel like people really, they just forget to attribute certain things, certain money that comes in to the podcast. But in the end, it was.
Yeah. And so, like, obviously, if you're selling a product or you're selling a course or you're doing one-on-ones or something like that, anybody who comes from your show, that is a direct revenue from your podcast that could be seen as attributed to your podcast. So if you're spending a certain amount of money every month on getting your podcast produced, then the client and whatever that client is worth to you can be weighed against that. And so that can be, that you build you build trust up with your audience, and because podcast listeners are a very trusting type of audience, they end up wanting to work with you and they book a one-on-one or whatever that is. But the other way that happens, the other way that you can get clients from your show is that you bring a potential client onto your show as a guest, and through the interview, you guys are working on something together, and so you're kind of mutually aligned towards a goal already. You'll get a really good feel for whether or not the client is a good fit for you, and vice versa. And by the end of it, you've probably developed some sort of trust, especially if the interview goes well. You'll have developed a certain amount of trust. And after the interview's over, you have a couple of minutes to chat, and they might end up. You never know. I mean, if the conversation is naturally kind of going towards them inquiring about your services or saying that they want to work with you, you may be able to have that person turn into a client. Which is especially 100%. Good if you're a business that works with few clients but big ticket clients, because then investing the time to bring them on the show and all of that will be very worth your time. And another interesting thing that I heard about this on a podcast is that, let's say you work at like, I don't know, a wood mill or something, right? Like you produce wood or repurpose wood or whatever, and let's say you have a podcast about that, something like that, or you have a podcast about business in general or something in that nature. If you ask a CEO of a large organization or some high up official in the wood production industry to come onto your podcast, you're most likely going to be the first person to ever ask that person to be on a podcast, because that is a very niche industry to talk about. And so people from that type of industry will be absolutely overjoyed with the idea of coming onto your show. 100%. So whether or not they become a client, you're definitely going to get them on. I mean, you're more than likely going to get them on their show because they are going to be very excited to talk about what they do, because they never get to.
Yeah.
And anyways, this person on the podcast that I'm referring to went deeper into that. But it was really interesting to hear that, because you can make a huge industry connection just by inviting someone who doesn't get to talk a lot onto your show regarding a niche subject.
Yeah, I don't even know if we have this as a as one of the ways to make money here on our notes or not, but I think when you get somebody on that also has a company that's like different from yours but in the same industry, oftentimes you might get like some kind of affiliate.
Yeah, professional partnership.
Yes, professional partnership with them, and that also makes money or can potentially make money, which is attributed to your podcast.
You guys can funnel clients to each other essentially
as well. Yeah.
We do talk about that in a couple things down here, so we'll go into that even more. But the next thing would be to sell something. That goes pretty hand in hand with the client thing. But like a course, a book is a very that's something that is a very good idea to use podcasting to promote. Whether you're going to be a guest on other people's podcasts or you're going to have the show yourself and have a book that you're going to promote, or a product, or like any kind of program.
100%.
These are all things that you can offer your listener a discount for coming from your podcast, because they're a podcast listener. And we have stats here about purchases. And so, Celine, do you want to say the stats on how many people purchase from podcasts?
So 60% of listeners have bought a product based on a podcast ad.
So 60% of listeners, 60%, we are included in that?
Yeah, 100%. And 54% of podcast listeners are likely to buy from brands they hear advertised on podcasts. I was actually going to ask you, like, what are the things that you have purchased from a podcast before?
I've purchased several books.
You want to say like
what books?
Yeah.
Well, definitely like 12 Rules for Life. I think I came from Jordan Peterson's podcast, or books about diet. Like different books about diet and stuff like that. But also like I listened to a podcast about coaching, about like why every business should have a coach. And then from that coaching episode, I actually went and hired a different coach, and I spent a significant amount of money on the program. So little did the coach who I worked with know, but he actually got me from a different podcast. So money is flowing through the podcast industry in ways that are unexpected.
Yeah.
But I'm sure like I've bought other products and stuff too.
Yeah. Nice. I was going to say you also purchased the book of the podcast host.
Oh yeah, right.
That's probably from the podcast. I assume. I'm not sure. This was way before my time, but
yeah, that was when I was first starting and learning about Podigy. I was listening to podcasts about podcasting like this one. And I did. I purchased courses. I purchased products from.
Exactly.
Yeah, totally. But then the next way would be industry connections, and that's sort of what, Celine, you were talking about, which is guests referring people. Well, first of all, guests referring people that they know to you. This is huge. I mean, if you bring somebody on your show, like we previously stated, there's a connection that's formed during the interview process.
Yeah.
And if you guys have complementary industries where, somebody may, well, I'll think about it from my perspective. Like we run a podcast company, and we just interviewed two people who have a AI show notes and transcribing service for podcasting. So we have complementary industries, and therefore when they hear about somebody who needs a podcast produced, they might send it to us, and vice versa.
And we have an affiliate link with them.
Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah. That can all be
like professional partnerships where you guys refer each other, and that can end up being revenue in all sorts of ways, potentially in very large ways. Yeah,
exactly. So I was going to say, if you, for example, are in a certain industry and you offer a service, but then you talk about this on your podcast, but you have somebody on that has a way, 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 way bigger firm that does something similar, but for like a couple selected very successful people, then they might refer people that are not able to pay that fee to you as well, because
they might be too expensive, and so then they can refer clients who don't have as much of a budget down towards the smaller companies.
Exactly.
Yeah, very true. The the next way, the fourth way, would be saving time.
Yeah.
So this is one of the ways that is like an indirect way of saving money.
Mm-hmm.
But for us, each of our episodes that we produce for Oh My Pod will net roughly around 6 to 8 hours of labor to produce the way that we want. So after the audio, the video for YouTube, the thumbnail for YouTube, all of the clips, posting all of the content, and the blog and all these different things that we create from our podcast, having the podcast saves us so much time in terms of how much time we would have to spend creating that content from scratch.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
And you have to, I think, especially when you're like self-employed or if you have your own business, you really have to think in terms of like, how much is my hour worth? And is what I'm doing worth doing, or should I, or is my time better spent on something else? And I'm sure if you have your own business, you've thought about this tons already in the past. And so it's a very logical like next step to like try to not waste any time, doing things yourself and trying to outsource as much as possible to people that are just like more professional in doing it, and it will take them way less time to do it. And so you both pretty much it's like a win-win, right?
Yeah. Because if you're spending 8 hours an episode and your hour is worth like $100 or $200, then it can be, roughly $1,000 per episode that you're spending.
So expensive.
So yeah, and obviously you don't need to spend that much time on your podcast, but to do it the way that we would recommend doing it to get the most efficiency or to get the most effectiveness out of your episodes, then yeah, it does take a really long time.
Yes.
So then the fifth way, this is the one that like everybody talks about, which is sponsorships. So getting ads onto your podcast. The problem with this is that it's pretty much a non-starter for really small shows.
Exactly.
Unless you're getting thousands of downloads per episode, your numbers are going to be quite low in terms of how much you're going to be expected to be paid for those ads on your show. So like a good example is $25 USD per 1,000 downloads for a 60-second ad. So you drop a 60-second ad, a minute-long ad, which is an interruption to your listener's experience. Yeah. And in return, you get $25 for 1,000 downloads. And 1,000 downloads per episode is that's quite a feat. If you've achieved 1,000 downloads per episode, then that in and of itself is a huge success. And then to only be rewarded with $25 for 1,000 downloads. So I do know that there's different ways that you can approach sponsorships, and there's also different like ad networks that are coming out. But from where it's currently at, $25 per 1,000 is the accepted industry rate. And now that's a little bit different than a long-term sponsorship, like a joint venture long-term sponsorship, which would be having one single sponsor for a long period of time, maybe even a year. And this sponsor not only appears on your podcast in the form of an ad, but they also get added to your artwork. Their logo gets put on your artwork. They get mentioned on your social media. And so they kind of get the feature spot across all of your platforms, in which case then you can negotiate a price based on how niche your listenership is. So for instance, if you have a podcast about like fishing in northern BC, and you've got 100 or 200 listeners, then you're probably a pretty good candidate for a fishing supply company who operates
mostly in Canada,
in British Columbia or in Canada. And so you could negotiate a sponsorship that could be more in your favor depending on how niche your audience is, which is why it's really important to niche when you start out and to figure out who you're going to talk to, because later down the road, a year down the road or 2 years down the road, when you do start exploring proper sponsorships, you could do a long-term sponsor with somebody. A good example of this, not as long-term, but we did pull up an example here of Tim Ferriss and his show. Tim Ferriss is one of the biggest podcasts, so he's getting millions of downloads per episode. But on the Tim Ferriss show, he charges $43,000 per episode. So that'll be probably an ad at the start, in the middle, and at the end. It might even just be at the start. I'm not totally sure about that. But the sponsors have to pay for a minimum of 2 episodes. So from every podcast sponsor, Tim is earning, $86,000 USD. So, and then obviously he's also earning royalties from the sale of the book and all the other things that he has that the podcast promotes. Tim has used podcasting in a way where it just skyrockets every part of his business all at once. So, but yeah, that's
another book that you've purchased.
Yep. Yes, that is another book that I purchased, 4 Hour Workweek.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so those are, how many ways were those? That was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 6 main ways that you can make money with your podcast. However, we do have a handful of kind of like rapid fire things that we don't know as much about and are probably more specific to the different industries that may approach podcasting. But so I mean, we can just hop right into them. One of those ways would be affiliate marketing. So promoting products or services from other companies and then earning like a little portion of that.
Yeah, and I would say the affiliate marketing is definitely, like, depending on what your podcast is about, like, this should not be underestimated. There are people making a lot of money from affiliate, like, things.
Absolutely.
Like, even if you are a podcast that endorses a lot of things that are available on Amazon, I would definitely look into it. It's maybe just a tiny little bit of like per purchase, but if you have the audience, and like we said, like a lot of people purchase from podcasts, I would do it because it doesn't take a lot of time. Like, it literally takes 2 seconds.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
And you might make quite a bit of money from it. And it just it's just like, you don't have to do anything for it, really.
Yeah, totally. Then this one's kind of cool: donations and crowdfunding. So
yeah,
if you do want to do, I guess you're just asking for donations to keep the show going. You'd probably be surprised if people really like your show, then they would probably love to support to keep it going.
Yes.
I've seen people do like buy me a coffee or whatever, where it's like a really small amount. But something that you could also explore would be to do like a paid version of your podcast feed, where there's like a barrier, and then people can pay to remove that and see like the full episodes. I would probably be very careful with doing something like that. You'd obviously be like limiting your potential listenership, but podcasting is also a platform that lends itself to delivering free value and free education to your listeners. And so to create a paywall is probably something that you want to do with very specific intentions.
Yeah, but I think there's also different ways of doing that. There's people that only have a paid show. There's people that have certain episodes that are on the paid platform, whereas others are still normally available for free, just like any other podcast. And then, for example, if you think about Jordan Peterson, because we mentioned him before, his podcasts are available everywhere, YouTube and all the platforms where you can listen to podcasts. But if you have, for example, a Daily Wire subscription, you can see everything without ads. Or I know that he has also a specific subscription only for his own podcast, where you can just listen to everything without any sort of ads.
Yes, totally. Because he does run ads on all of his...
Yeah, that applies obviously to bigger shows, because maybe a smaller show will not have the thing where like there's like 3, 4, 5 ads.
Exactly.
Because like they can't even get that many ads. But that's also something to think about. There's like different possibilities of like member subscriptions and stuff like that.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
The next way would be live events and speaking engagements. So if your show does become some kind of if you do experience some kind of success with your show and you're finding that you have a community, then doing a live event for people to kind of see you do a podcast live, or just a talk or a meetup or something like that. That obviously this does apply to bigger shows, so this is very specific. Because if you have a show, you're going to have listeners from all over the world, and it's probably going to be quite difficult to get people into one spot. But yeah, so anyways, that's sort of a specific one for some people.
Yeah, and actually, we always say this, but we record on Riverside, and Riverside actually has a function to stream a live event like that. So if you're currently on Riverside, you can do it from here, so you don't need any extra subscription for this or anything.
I had in my mind like an actual like in-person event, which would be really cool. But
a lot of people do like a live podcast episode where they're just live on Riverside and will
totally.
And we'll just stream it live. Yeah.
The next one would be like merchandise sales. That's pretty self-explanatory.
Yes.
Whatever you've got for your show, if you want to sell merch, just like anything else. Sponsored interviews and collaborations. So, I guess if you have a big audience and you don't just accept anyone, you could have guests compensate you in return for you giving them a platform to promote whatever they're promoting or to promote the personal brand. But again, let me just say, like, take it with a grain of salt. I think this can work for some people, but the way that I approach podcasting is, again, trying to keep it as authentic and as real and personal as possible. And I just think that bringing a guest onto your show and requiring them to pay to be on your show doesn't lend itself very well to the medium of podcasting.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not really a fan of that, to be completely frank.
I do think that there's a way that people could do it where it's just totally mutually beneficial and it's totally worth the person's money.
That's very true. Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, but generally speaking, especially if listeners are starting out, don't have a ton of like followers, unless you're already quite like famous and have a big following. But other than that, I don't know about it. What a lot of people do is like a collaboration where it's just like beneficial to the both of them, where they would just like be guests on the other person's show if they have a show and swap it like this, or maybe just even swap a little ad of the other podcast in the other person's show and vice versa, so that it's like mutually beneficial with no actual cash flow, but actually an exchange of like that.
Agreed. And then the last one would be consulting and coaching. So the reason why we put this in is because if you start out as a coach, you are going to have you're going to first of all have to prove that you're an expert at what you do. And you're also going to be able to charge more the more clients that you get and the more popularity that you achieve. So through your podcast, you're building your personal brand, you're proving your expertise, you're building up your authority. And this is going to allow you to increase the price of your coaching, to increase the price of your programs. And over time, you may even find that if your podcast does incredibly well and you're able to really build a personal brand and bring some high industry, highly respected people onto the show and boost your personal brand like crazy, your coaching prices can just absolutely skyrocket through the roof because you have more people who are wanting to spend that hour with you, or more people who are wanting to get involved in your program. So this is more of like, you are going to be using your podcast as a way to educate people, improve your expertise, and sell yourself and as a coach and as an expert. But this is just sort of saying the podcast will hopefully allow you to raise your prices over time and therefore bring you in more money as you do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think for coaches, coaches, I think it's a lot of coaches start out working just one-on-one, and I think a podcast and attraction of podcast guests can be very beneficial to sell some kind of program that can
or course
serve
or something,
course, exactly,
to
that can serve more people, and I think that's a great idea, and I've actually definitely purchased stuff like that from podcasts before, as well as like, for example, some kind of like journaling guides or like courses on, on all sorts of things. Like people sell like meditation courses. They sell different like food, like dietary advice with like ebooks that they sell, and they just endorse that on their podcast.
Totally.
Which is a form of coaching, but just like not in a one-on-one form, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So those are the ways that, that's what we tell people when they ask us how podcasts make money.
Mm-hmm.
With a bigger emphasis on the first few that we discussed, because obviously those are the ones that are the most reliable. And but I hope that there were some strategies in there that you can go ahead and apply to your own podcast, because I think that there's a lot of, like Celine said earlier, there's a lot of revenue that can come from your podcast that might not be properly attributed to your podcast. And at the same time, there's maybe ways that there's things that you could be doing right now to help pay for the expenses of the podcast that you are not currently doing. And so,
correct.
And it's important to get a return on your investment when you're podcasting. That's sort of the purpose of podcasting in a lot of ways. I think that you should be getting a return on your investment. It shouldn't just be a money sink.
Yeah, for sure. 100%.
But yeah, thank you for listening. And tune in next week for an interview that we're going to be doing with Alexander Ohm. He is might be Alexander Ohm. I've never heard his name spoken.
I think
it's Ohm.
But that's actually just like I think that's just a name that he presents himself with. His actual last name is something else.
I don't think so. I think that's actually it.
No, I'm
Oh, okay.
I know that.
Well, anyways, he's one of our business coaches, and he's awesome. So he's going to be giving some insight on a bunch of things, and that'll be next week. And as always, if you want to reach out to us and send us questions or just give us some feedback, you can reach out to us at ohmypod@podigypodcasts.com, ohmypod@podigypodcast.com. That'll also be in the show notes. And yeah, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear some of the questions that you have that you want to get answers to. We might even create a whole episode around it and shout you out for the question. So yeah, thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.